course, we are recording, so when you do give your questions at the end, could you please speak loudly and clearly? They'll be recorded, and if you have any issues with that, please let us know. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Ruth Byrne from the University of Lancaster, where she's working on a PhD looking at corpus linguistics, considering particularly topics of immigrants and refugees in 19th century newspapers, particularly those found in the BL collection. And she's working with Ian Gregory and Andrew Hardy there on that topic. And tonight she's going to speak to us, I believe it's an aspect of your PhD, isn't it? Or coming out of the PhD.
Yeah.
And the official title is The Language of Migration in the Victorian Press, a Corpus Linguistic Approach. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you. So thanks for coming today, and thanks for anyone who's watching along online. And I've been told that that includes my mum. So I've had quite a nasty cold for the past week and a half, so I'm going to apologise in advance if I have to sort of sneeze or my voice goes a little bit partway through. So I'm going to start by talking about the 1905 Aliens Act, which has really acquired symbolic significance as the first piece of modern British immigration legislation. Now, in reality, it was quite poorly enforced and quite widely considered ineffectual, but it really laid a lot of the infrastructure that we have in place today. So in the UK, alien retains little of its 19th century meaning. So I'm sure that if you went to ask someone on the streets of London what the word alien brings to mind, chances are they'd say something like this. But the words most associated with alien in the British National Corpus, which contains a cross-section of present-day English, relate to science fiction aliens. There's a lot of references to the Ridley Scott film franchise, but having traced the associations of the word over time, this modern meaning didn't really emerge until about the 1920s. So in 19th century Britain, alien was the government's term of choice for foreign-born nationals who resided in the country and hadn't undergone the process of naturalisation. And although exact numbers are uncertain, the process was complex and expensive, and many of Britain's foreign-born inhabitants remained technically alien, despite having lived in the nation for considerable periods of time. So the term was frequently used in Parliament, and as you can see from the naturalisation certificate, favoured over terms like immigrant and migrant in official parlance. Now, whilst looking at definitions of the term alien, I came across an entry in the Jewish Virtual Library. Now, the website gives a potted history of the Aliens Act, in which they feel the need to justify the term alien for a modern audience. Now, in British law, the website states, the age-old term alien is used to designate someone who is not a citizen of Britain or its empire. It has no derogatory connotations. And as a historian with one foot in the linguistics department, I really felt that I had to take umbrage with this statement, particularly the last little bit. And I do this primarily in the belief that, as a linguist, I don't think any words have no connotations, but also because the terminology surrounding immigrant groups is so widely recognised as being loaded with derogatory connotations, both explicit and implicit. To the extent that when you're doing the kind of research that I'm doing and when you're giving a presentation like this, you become really quite self-conscious about word choice. So I'm using the word immigrant at the moment, I've used migrant in the past, and I'm still not 100% sure which sounds best. So if anyone has any ideas about this afterwards, I'd love to hear about it. That the term alien was used in legal contexts doesn't necessarily exempt it from these connotations. Now, linguists O'Doherty and Lakuta seek to problematise the labels that we use to aggregate whole groups of people, so labels like alien, warning us against viewing them as natural categories. And another linguist, Hoey, argues that every time we use a word and every time we encounter it anew, the experience either reinforces our priming by confirming an existing association or weakens it. And what this kind of boils down to, what he's really arguing here, is that words are saturated with meaning and that is context dependent. And if we really follow this line of reasoning, then a word which is frequently encountered in negative contexts will then subconsciously be attributed negative associations when it's encountered in the future. And I think this is why a simple choice between one word and another can have deep implications. And one of the reasons I found this particular website, this particular entry, if we go back, particularly striking, is that historians who study 19th century Britain will know that people who arrived from Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire, particularly those who were Jewish, were uniquely targeted by anti-alien campaigners in this time period. And it was their arrival into Britain in large numbers in the last few decades of the 19th century that's kind of widely recognised as the main catalyst for the 1905 Aliens Act. Now, if we look at the census data, for quite a while, the largest immigrant groups to arrive into Britain were from France and Germany. And this was the case in the 1850s, it remained so until the 1880s. However, as this graph shows, arrivals from Russia, many of whom were Eastern European Jews fleeing persecution and economic hardship, began to arrive in large numbers in the last few decades of the century, and by its end they'd become the most populous immigrant group. So although alien may have been used in an objective manner in official legislation and documentation, as immigration restriction became the subject of popular debate in the 19th century, the word alien proliferated through the newspapers, and I'll argue that the result of this was, as Glover states, a blurring of the division between the letter of the law and everyday prejudice. Now, this paper will use corpus linguistics to gain a better understanding of the connotations of the word alien in the 19th century, particularly the end of the century. And I'm also interested in seeing if there was a noticeable shift in the word's meaning as the composition of Britain's immigrant population changed in these last few decades. Now, for those of you who haven't used it before, and I know a few people in this room have, corpus linguistics is the computer-assisted analysis of large bodies of text. And it's fairly ubiquitous within the field of linguistics, but it's only really beginning to be utilised by historians. And one of the appeals of it for the historian is that it can be used to conduct a broad survey of text and kind of highlight patterns in language usage, which may not be initially apparent to the naked eye. And then these can be downsampled to a size which is more manageable for close reading. So I'm from a history background, and before I'd heard of corpus linguistics, I'd previously tried to do language analysis on quite large newspaper texts. I think during my MA, I tried to do a sort of analysis of the language surrounding Indian independence in the Times newspaper, and it involved a lot of manually counting words, which isn't particularly fun. So I also think that the kind of the current interfaces of digital archives, although they have many advantages, don't necessarily lend themselves to the kind of study of long-term language change, not least because articles need to be opened one at a time in separate browser windows. So as you can imagine, the idea that I could look at a word's association over decades, over a whole newspaper run, and quite quickly quantify results was really quite appealing. So as was mentioned before, I'm a PhD student, and my thesis examines the way in which different 19th century newspapers framed immigrants and refugees. And in the process aims to really provide a case study for how a historian with quite limited technical ability can use a corpus methodology to answer historical research questions. And as such, the thesis takes quite a reflective approach, and so it highlights a lot of the limitations of corpus linguistics as well as the benefits of it. But today I'm really going to focus on results rather than the kind of issues I've encountered along the way, though I'd be happy to talk about those in the questions afterwards. So I primarily use CQP Web to access my digital newspapers, and in case you're not familiar with it, it's a web-based concordancer, which is basically a computer program into which corpora, or large bodies of text, are uploaded, and it can then be used to access, search, and apply various means of analysis to them, and it was developed at Lancaster University. So my thesis currently features 5 newspapers, hopefully that will become 6, And I'm not going to talk about them all in depth today because that could take the whole hour. So to keep things simple, when I talk about my results more generally, they're going to be based on findings from this broader sample of newspapers. But whenever I illustrate these trends or use examples or get up graphs, it's going to be from these two titles, and that's the Pall Gazette and Reynolds newspaper. Now, both were London-based, but I think it's quite difficult to talk about a national and a regional press at this period of time. Because, for instance, Reynolds' newspaper was reportedly distributed in the northwest of England, in the Midlands, in industrial Scotland and South Wales. So it was read quite a lot further afield than just London. So the Pall Gazette was published from 1865, and its frequent staff changes make its politics really quite hard to pin down. So it began life as a conservative paper, but became more liberal after an ownership change caused its staff to walk out en masse. Then, under perhaps its most famous editor, Stead, it championed moral and social issues. But towards the end of the century, which, as you'll see a bit later, is the kind of key period when aliens really began to make the news, the paper returns to its conservative roots. And despite its shifting staff, the paper was always consumed by a more affluent audience. Now, in contrast, Reynolds was highly radical, and for quite a lot of the period in question, its masthead featured the blazon, "By the people, for the people," which kind of makes apparent its populist angle. It had a very large working class readership, and some historians believe that although you can't really talk of mass readerships in this period, that arguably it was amongst the first papers to reach any kind of mass readership. Now, it also had a vast hidden readership because low working class literacy fostered a culture of communal newspaper ownership. And there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence for this. And that this includes a letter written by a man called Wesley Perrins to the Reynolds newspaper. And he described his grandfather as one of a group of 12 men who paid half a penny each to buy a copy of the paper, and then they'd go back to his grandfather's nail shop, where presumably the only literate one, he'd then read the paper aloud to them. So it provided a vehicle for the views of its editor, G.W.M. Reynolds, a middle-class chartist and a publisher of cheap fiction. And the paper contained an appealing cocktail of political content and sensationalist reports of house fires, shipwrecks and lurid criminal trials. Now, this chart shows the amount which each newspaper used the term alien, and it's been normalised for comparative purposes. And if you can see that at the back, the Pall Gazette is in blue and Reynolds in red. And it basically shows that there was an increase in the term's usage in both papers, and also that as a proportion of its content, the working class Reynolds mentioned aliens the most. But I think this is when working with this kind of aggregate data becomes more complicated, because it's not quite so simple as that. Because the Pall was a daily paper, and Reynolds was published on Sundays when the working person would read the newspaper. So this means that the Pall Gazette corpus is considerably larger than Reynolds' corpus. So it really comes down to a question of where you think the influence of the newspaper lies, whether it's in the proportion of its content, which it dedicated to a topic, or the sheer volume with which it mentioned it over time. And I still haven't quite decided the answer to that myself. Now, on its own, this data doesn't really tell us very much. But if we look at the collocates of alien for each decade, a shift in the wider associations of the word is apparent in both of the newspapers. So if you've not worked with corpus linguistics before, collocation is a method that's used a great deal and that I'm going to be using throughout the paper, so I'm going to just really briefly explain it. So basically, it's the statistically significant co-occurrence of two words. So if two words appear in close proximity more often than we'd expect, based upon how often they appear in the newspaper as a whole, then we'd say that they form a collocation. And it's quite a useful technique for historians, as it provides quite a quick means of accessing the context, the immediate context in which a word was discussed. And to me, I think it's perhaps best thought of as the network of language which immediately surrounded a word, in this case alien. However, the problem with collocation is that words are decontextualized and they can be quite easily misread. So it's generally combined with a reading of the concordance lines, which show the collocates in their immediate textual context. So, for example, if I wanted to know how alien associated or collocated with the word immigration at the top of this list, then I could look at, say, 10 or 20 words of context either side of the collocation, like this. And I can basically see that it quite often appeared as part of the phrase, the immigration of destitute aliens. And I think maybe the bottom 6 or 7 lines here kind of include that iteration of the 2 words being used. And so another thing I did was, if this text was too ambiguous to really get a clear idea of how the word was being used in context, I would return to a more traditional interface, like Gale primary sources, to sort of see how alien was being used on the original newspaper page. And I think I'd like to stress how important I think it is to be flexible with these kind of methods. So I think it's useful to see corpus linguistics as a lens which can be used to look at texts at a distance, but that I think it's most effective when combined with more traditional methods and kind of the researcher moves back and forth between them. So here we've got a visualization of the collocates of alien in the 1870s. And I've kind of laid it out like this because I think it's a little bit jazzier than that, but also because it allows more words to be featured on the screen at the same time, so you kind of get a better impression of what's going on. And in all of these slides, the Pall Gazette is the bigger cloud in the top left, and Reynolds newspaper is the smaller cloud in the bottom right. And that has to do with the relative size of the corpora, the kind of amount of collocates that have been generated. Now, the first thing you can see here is that not that many collocates have been generated for alien in the 1870s. And this is partially because alien didn't appear in the newspapers that many times. It doesn't appear to have been a particularly newsworthy word. And I've also looked at the word immigrant, and it's a similar thing. It wasn't really used that frequently in this period to describe people coming into Britain. Alien was the word that was kind of favoured, and it wasn't featured very much. And you also won't be able to tell it from seeing this slide alone, but the main collocates, sort of blood, religion, races, language, they don't actually have anything to do with immigration. So during this period, alien was also used as an adjective to denote something which was strange or different, which is a usage that's retained today. So for example, in the Pall Gazette, a man was described as being assaulted for wearing a top hat to a public house because it was considered alien to the habits and feelings of the locality. And elsewhere, various proposed political amendments were described as alien to the habits of the English people. And when used in these contexts unrelated to immigration, I think it's worth mentioning that the associations of alien were very negative. So I think although these examples are drawn from non-immigration uses of the word, you could make an argument that the fact that it had such a negative connotation would then influence how people saw it when it was used to describe immigration. So here are the collocates from the 1880s, so there are a few more, and you can still see words like race and church and religion that kind of denote these non-immigration uses. So what I've actually done is remove them. So these are just the collocates which appeared when alien was being used to discuss immigration into Britain. And there were two, having kind of read these in context, there's two main themes which kind of emerge in the reporting in the 1880s. And the first of these is legislation-based. So collocates like laws, non-resident, and act all appeared in articles about alien restrictions being passed in other countries, particularly America, which had sanctioned the ability of immigrants to own property. And the collocates also began to feature in articles which discussed the potential of Britain following suit. And this, having looked at refugee, this is something that was much more prominently associated with the word refugee. as there were kind of really heated discussions in the papers as to whether the passing of legislation that restricted immigration would have an impact on the ability of people to claim asylum in Britain. So there was quite a lot of kind of heart-wrenching stuff over this, a real kind of emotive debates. And that kind of spilt over slightly into the collocates for Alien, into the kind of discussion of aliens. But I think the focus here was more on whether Britain should follow other countries' leads and actually pass this legislation. Now, the collocate naturalisation featured in articles listing the number of people naturalised each month. And these were often kind of verbatim lists of statistics, or tables of statistics, with very little editorial input, but often there was kind of editorialising through the headlines. So you'd get these articles, and this also happened with port returns, sort of lists of alien arrivals at Tilbury Docks in London, and they'd have headlines which would say things like dramatic increase in alien numbers in June, and that kind of thing on an otherwise just completely neutrally worded article, which is quite interesting. Now, the other one that you should be able to see here, which is in both of the newspapers, is Destitute. And this really appeared in articles kind of concerned with impoverished aliens entering Britain. And I think this is something that becomes a lot more significant, so I'm going to revisit it in a moment. And I think, so here we've got the collocates for Alien in the 1890s. And you'll see that the number of collocates has expanded quite dramatically. And to put this in perspective, that's the 1870s compared with the 1890s. So it's being discussed an awful lot more to be able to generate these extra associations. And not only was Alien appearing more in the newspapers and generating more collocates, but now almost all of these collocates relate to immigration. So to give Reynolds' newspaper as an example, in the 1860s and 70s, none of the collocates generated by Alien in Reynolds related to immigration. In the 80s, about 30% of them did, and in the 90s, over 90% of them did. And I don't think this is because the other usage is going away. I think it's just that Alien Immigrants were so newsworthy that it kind of dominates this other use. I think it's still there, but it's virtually not registering. And I'm now going to look at some of these collocates in a little more depth to kind of demonstrate how they were actually being used in practice. Now, a common tactic employed by linguists is to group collocates together which were used in a similar manner or expressed a similar sentiment in order to identify patterns in language use. And I think as well as revealing patterns, it can also change the way we weight collocates, kind of the importance we place on them. Now, you may have noticed earlier that some of the collocates only really associated with aliens sort of 10 or 12 times, which I don't know about you, but I don't really think that's that many compared to when you think how often newspapers are reporting upon immigration today. And I think it's worth considering that if 10 similar words were also associating with alien 10 or 12 times, then that kind of indicates that this collocate is indicative of a wider trend and kind of gives it more clout. So I think once you start to group them together and you notice similar patterns emerging, it does kind of change the way you view them. So, for example, Alien generated the collocates law, act, bill, which I grouped into a legislation category, as kind of one of the main discourses surrounding aliens in this period. Now, linguists Gabriel Artas and Baker used this method in their analysis of the contemporary language surrounding refugees and asylum seekers, and they found that across a variety of news texts, several linguistic strategies were kind of repeatedly used. And one of these was water metaphors. So they found that across all the newspapers they looked at, refugee movement was very often referred to as a flood or a tide. So this grouping of collocates can be done in automated and manual ways. And I decided ultimately to do it manually since, as you've seen, some of these collocates have quite ambiguous meanings. And I think they really needed to be read in their original context to be sort of categorised correctly. Now, This table shows the colloquy groups that I identified in relation to alien across all 5 of the newspapers. Now, I'm going to explore some of these groups in a bit more depth in a moment if you can't see them at the back. And originally my intention was to kind of only include collocates that associated with alien in at least, say, 2 of the 5 newspapers. But I actually found that I didn't really need to do this in practice, because virtually all of the collocates I came across were quite common to multiple newspapers. There were very few that were unique to just one paper. It was the same kinds of words appearing again and again and again. And this isn't just true of the 5 I've looked at when I've been and looked at other newspapers in the 19th century collection. It's the same kind of words that are appearing in the top 10 or 20 associating with the word alien. And it kind of got to the point where you'd have several browser windows open with your collocate lists in, and you'd kind of lose track of which belonged to which newspaper, because there were so many similarities between them. And I actually think that the fact that I only really managed to identify 9 main semantic groups within collocates generated from roughly 16,000 results kind of indicates that alien did have strong associations with quite a narrow range of topics. Now, I've thought about this, and I think there may be several practical reasons for this press consensus. So, all of the newspapers reported parliamentary debates, often verbatim, and it was in this kind of context that alien frequently appeared. So, newspapers reporting the same speeches again and again and again is obviously going to cause the same words and phrases to appear frequently across the corpora. And this was also exacerbated by the prevalence of scissors and paste journalism, as editors often reused content from other titles, and this was sometimes attributed and sometimes not. But you ended up with these kind of networks of articles moving between different papers. But I know that this has been a topic of kind of previous IHR seminars with people like Melody Beals, so I'm going to kind of move on from that. But I think it's worth keeping in mind as a kind of possible reason for why different newspapers were framing alien using very similar language. And these practices mean that it's sometimes very difficult to tell whether a newspaper and its staff is consciously framing aliens in a certain way, whether it's their opinion, or whether they're simply recycling the words of others. But I've thought about this, and I don't necessarily think it lessens the impact which that framing had. So if you think newspapers were one of the main ways by which people received information in the 19th century, and as James Curran indicates, they were often the only readily available source of what was happening outside the local community. And I think it's hugely problematic to try and establish the impact which individual articles had on readers. So as Hampton states, we're unlikely to ever reach a satisfactory conclusion about the nature of press influence today, never mind in Victorian Britain. So we can't really know whether an individual article about aliens was skimmed over to get to a more sensationalist story, or whether it was disseminated and dissected in a pub or a meeting. But I think if a group of people, in this case aliens, was repeatedly spoken about in a specific way, then it's quite difficult to deny that it's going to have some kind of impact on wider public perceptions, even if that impact is very difficult or impossible to quantify. So to get back to the collocate groups, I think some of these were more surprising than others. So if speculating about the way in which aliens were going to be discussed in the 19th century press, it may have been possible to guess that they'd be talked about in relation to their numbers or their movement. But I think even these potentially predictable groups reveal quite a great deal about the figure of the alien once their intricacies have really been teased apart. So when newspapers discussed alien movement, the collocates all related to the arrival of aliens at their destinations. So verbs like landing, arriving, arrived appeared in both the Pall Gazette and Reynolds, but there were no collocates which suggested that alien immigration was part of a wider migratory journey. And having studied the word refugee, I can tell you that it did associate with terms which kind of acknowledged this wider journey. It didn't just associate with terms indicating arrival. And aliens appear to have been spoken about primarily from the point at which they arrived in Britain and became a domestic concern. Now, certain discourses were also kind of noticeable by their absence. So I was quite surprised when I found that the newspapers didn't really generate many collocates relating to alien identity. I think I'd kind of assumed that as anyone classified as an alien had at some point resided in another country, that this would form part of their press identity. But what I found was that aliens were generally spoken about in abstract terms, so the newspapers didn't discuss their gender, age, religion, politics, nationality, ethnicity, and this ambiguity could simply be because the term was a legal label, sort of intended to denote a state of being rather than an individual. But if you look at the other collocates and look at how the newspapers were actually using it, they were using the word to discuss actual groups of people. They were talking about visiting aliens' residential quarters and talking about kind of specific aliens who arrived on the docks. People were described as aliens. So I think this lack of specificity just kind of had the result of dehumanising the alien. And I think you can see this same dehumanisation at play in these images from the book The Alien Immigrants by William Evans Gordon. And this was published at the height of the anti-alien debates. So if you can't see the captions, the one on the right is captioned Alien Fishwives Stepney, and the one on the left is Alien Butchers Stepney. So they kind of demonstrate the word alien being used as a descriptor for groups of people on the street. Now, in contrast, the word refugee generated a lot of collocates to do with identity. So refugees were spoken about in relation to their country of origin, their politics, their religion, their gender. So here we've got Russian, Bulgarian, Serbian refugees. We've got refugees who are Protestant, Christian, Jewish, and we've got refugees being described as political, specifically nihilist, socialist and communist. And some of this was because of the reasons that they were making the news. So a lot of refugees were making the news specifically because of their political activity. But some of it was just that there does seem to have just been a more multifaceted media identity surrounding the refugee when they made the press. Now, the only words that could be used to ascertain the provenance of the aliens being discussed were Jew and Jews in the Pall Gazette and Jews in Reynolds' newspaper. And even these collocates occurred very few times. So, for instance, the word Jew only associated with alien 8 times in the Gazette and 7 times in Reynolds. And this is, I should say, within a 10-word span, so it's 5 words either side. So I found it quite striking how infrequently Judaism was associated with the alien, considering how frequently they're equated in the historiography. Because the sort of, as mentioned, the 1905 Aliens Act is widely considered as a backlash against the increased numbers of poor Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. Now, anything relating to absences is kind of inherently difficult to prove, but from a reading of the concordance lines, I'm currently of the opinion that alien collocated with so few identity terms because there was almost an unspoken understanding of what alien actually referred to. And there's several reasons that I think this. I think the first is there were a number of official government reports commissioned during this period, and they generally had titles like the report into the sweating system, the report into alien immigration. But if you look at the witnesses being called and if you look at what's being spoken about, they're predominantly concerned with Jewish immigration. And also, when reading the context and reading the wider articles in which a lot of these collocates occurred, you kind of come across a lot of kind of veiled references to Judaism, including sort of veiled anti-Semitic remarks. And another quite striking thing is that when anti-alien polemicists wrote for the newspapers, so Arnold White, who was kind of virulently anti-immigration, sometimes wrote for the Pall Gazette, and he would often include a line saying, "I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm not against Jewish people." He would almost kind of negate a charge that wasn't even being made against them. So I think this all kind of combines to indicate that the identity of the alien didn't need to be spelled out in the 1890s because there was kind of a broad understanding of who the alien was. Now, one of the main ways in which aliens were discussed was in terms of their numbers. And actual numbers like 10,000, 6,000, 300 don't appear within the collocates. And again, this is because of their inherent lack of uniformity. So if you get lots of different articles using lots of different numbers, then no one number is going to appear often enough to be a collocate, but they were there in the wider context. But the collocates that did appear were those that were kind of more generic words to denote a large amount of something. And these included two which I'm going to look at now, which were the metaphors influx and importation. Now, importation was part of a wider metaphor which compared aliens to traded goods. And you can see some examples of it here. So we've got the paper quoting someone, this is the Pall Gazette, quoting someone who's saying that cholera is made easier by the importation of infected pauper aliens. And then we have someone, I think this is part of an election pledge, the fourth line down, where he's saying that he would stop the importation of aliens and he would also close a very large number of the public houses. So I'm not quite sure how successful he was on those claims. But I think that you can also see that the phrase the collocate importation normally appears as part of the phrase the importation of something aliens. And so I was thinking, how is importation being used in the newspapers more widely? Because I found it quite a curiously passive construction for people who were arriving of their own volition, that they were described as being imported. So I searched for importation of in the two newspapers as a whole, and I found that it was most frequently followed by cattle, arms, slaves and corn in the Gazette, and cattle, arms, corn and disease in Reynolds' newspaper. So in the 19th century, like today, people weren't usually imported, but rather animals, livestock and kind of goods and objects were. And the metaphor really borrows language which characterised earlier free trade debates. And there are instances where this goods metaphor wasn't even explicitly present, but individuals taking an anti-immigration stance were accused of being protectionist. And this seems to kind of indicate a mental link being made between the protection of British industries from foreign goods, which had been the subject of many high-profile campaigns in the preceding years, and the perceived impact of pauper aliens on British workers. Now, I think the previously mentioned dehumanisation was also apparent in the collocate influx, which appeared in the Pall Gazette. Now, influx is used to signify the arrival of large and possibly overwhelming numbers, but its meaning is also intertwined with water. So it originated from the Latin to flow in, and in the 16th century it denoted an inflow of a substance like a liquid or a gas. So along with words like stream and tide, it's a 19th century example of the water metaphor, which, as I mentioned, a number of contemporary researchers have found to be very prevalent in the language surrounding refugees and asylum seekers. Chilton, who is a linguist who's examined metaphor in political speeches, suggests that once a metaphorical concept like water's been evoked, then it brings with it associations. So he argues that floodwater is dangerous, floodwater can overwhelm, and that it requires action to be taken in the form of flood defences. So he's kind of arguing that with metaphors like this, they're incredibly evocative because they play upon people's wider fears. Now, whenever I looked at the wider context of the alien, whenever I read the concordance lines to see these collocates being used in this sort of wider article, metaphors appeared. And like numbers, I think the wide variety of ways in which these metaphors manifested meant that not that many of them actually collocated. And I think that's kind of one of the issues with collocation as a technique. But for instance, the water metaphor was expressed using at least 16 different words, some of which are on the board. And I also came across a wide variety of different metaphors. So newspapers adopted military language to discuss Britain's invasion by hordes of aliens. Britain was described as a dumping ground, the implication being that aliens were rubbish. And there were also medical frames of reference, as legislation was often described as a remedy to social issues. And although all the newspapers in the sample did use metaphor, I found that they featured most heavily in the Pall Gazette, which may fit with the more literary style in which it's written. Now, although metaphor arguably dehumanised the alien, it wasn't always used in a discriminatory way. So Reynolds' newspaper included the following quote from Gladstone, and he stated that it was not wise for a country which exported a particular commodity to lay restraint upon the importation of that commodity. So basically, he's using a trade metaphor to point out that as Britain itself exported poverty, it wasn't really in the best position to criticise other nations for doing the same thing. And he also used the water metaphor in a different speech that was quoted in Reynolds. So Gladstone said that compared to the British labour market as a whole, immigration was simply a drop in the ocean. Now, the discourse which most closely associated with Alien in all of the newspapers was poverty. So this is in the 5 in the sample, but also whenever I've looked at another newspaper, you can pretty much guarantee that in this period, poverty terms are going to be in the top 5 results associated with Alien. And although the historiography suggests that economic factors would appear in discussions of Alien, I found it quite striking that this was sort of simplified down to poverty. So the kind of other collocates relating to economics were absent. It was really all about pauperism and destitution. Now, this connection was common across the press, as I've said, but it doesn't appear to have been limited to the press. So a quick corpus analysis of Hansard, which is the archive of the proceedings of the UK Parliament, kind of shows that in the 1890s, the phrase destitute alien appeared 62 times in parliamentary debates, which is sort of more than the alien, which appeared 49 times, and the aliens, which is 25. So this does appear to have kind of been a wider phrase that was going around, and you do come across it a lot in kind of anti-alien literature written by kind of polemicists at the time as well. Now, if you remember, this was an association which appeared in the 1880s, and this kind of shows that the association between aliens and poverty didn't appear before 1887, which does seem to indicate that it was being associated with immigrant groups who primarily arrived after that point. So how were pauper aliens being discussed? So most often it was as a social issue. Within the newspaper sample as a whole, the pauper alien emerges as quite a paradoxical figure. So they're spoken about as sort of stealing jobs while simultaneously draining the poor relief. And certain economic charges repeatedly appeared in these articles more widely. And these can kind of be categorised under the following headings. So pauper aliens were described as providing unfair competition, kind of lowering remuneration by working for starvation wages, taking jobs and ousting British workmen. And these criticisms were very often explicitly linked to the sweating system. So there seems to have been something of a moral panic in this period surrounding London sweatshops and the exploitation which occurred within them. The alien was also reported, this is kind of less frequently I think, to be the cause of urban overcrowding and congestion and a bringer of disease, particularly cholera. Interestingly, although it did feature some of these charges, the Pall Gazette seemed to favour euphemisms over specific discussions of the issues it had with the pauper aliens. So it focused less on the kind of intricacies of job competition and wage undercutting, and instead discussed, and I quote, the evils which had arisen in the East End of London. And it also used phrases like the question of, or the issue of, and I think question and issue both appeared as collocates. Now, this reliance on euphemism may have been because the Gazette's readers were less directly impacted or had less direct experience of what was going on, but I'm still kind of uncertain on that point. But in contrast, the working class Reynolds had an incredibly conflicted tone. So Reynolds did feature these criticisms, and quite luridly. However, it also, in other places, supported the concept of an international community of workers. It was a radical newspaper, which meant that often it jumped to the aliens' defence in the sort of the face of perceived middle and upper class opposition. And as I mentioned earlier, I think Reynolds was perhaps the staunchest defendant of the right of asylum. So although it did complain about the impact of immigration, it was hugely in opposition throughout this period to the idea of any kind of legislation being passed, because it would impact the right of asylum, which would affect political refugees coming in from the continent. So it's really quite a conflicted paper. So it cited reports by the Manchester Board of Guardians, which described aliens as industrious, but it also featured some highly inflammatory anti-alien letters from readers. And although it didn't support them, it printed them and didn't negate them. And I think often Reynolds, the editor, sort of micromanaged the paper to a great degree, and to the extent where he would footnote the correspondence section sometimes and write replies to all the letters. And the kind of, I think he did that less as this period went on. So by the 1890s, he wasn't doing that as much. But the letters I've come across that are sort of, that have the anti-alien comments, he isn't commenting on those. So there was one letter written under the pen name Northumbrian, and Northumbrian said, and I quote, that the East End of London positively swarms with filthy foreigners who herd together like beasts. So that kind of contrasts with the whole international community of workers concept, which may have appeared in the very next issue. I think one way of rationalising these conflicting views is that Reynolds was trying to cater to the opinions of a very large and conflicted audience, which meant that the integrity of its political message was sacrificed on occasion. And this is an aside, but I think it's quite an interesting one, that in Reynolds' newspaper, the poor pet alien wasn't always poor. So the newspaper was, as I mentioned, stridently Republican, and it used the anti-alien mood as an opportunity to attack the royal family. So in one instance, the paper interrupted a social commentary piece on poverty in British cities to consider the fact, and I quote, that we have amongst us a whole tribe of alien and native paupers, the royal family, upon whom the utmost tenderness is lavished. And when it commented on Lord Salisbury's proposed alien bill, it often gleefully suggested that, and I quote, if aliens in England are to be cleared out, our German royal family will have to go with them. Now, to summarise, in the last few decades of the 19th century, the term alien was most often used to describe new arrivals into Britain, despite, in its legal sense, applying to a much larger group of individuals who'd not been naturalised. And I think this really kind of fits into the idea of news values, and when we think about kind of what's newsworthy and what's not newsworthy, and the commonplace is often not newsworthy. So if the term alien was used accurately, it would have referred to German sugar bakers, French teachers, French governesses, Italian waiters, many other groups living and working in 19th century Britain. Instead, it was used ambiguously and consistently lacked specificity as to who the alien in question actually was, instead relying on euphemism. What it was specific about was the fact that the aliens were impoverished, they were arriving at quite an alarming rate, and they were associated with economic issues. Now, this lack of specificity, whether intended or not, served to dehumanise the alien and really meant that the issues were discussed in isolation from the immigrants themselves. Now, perhaps the most interesting finding for me was that the alien was framed in a very similar manner by both the pro and anti-immigration lobbies. So all of the papers, including Reynolds, which was often pro-immigration, generated very similar collocates. Both sides discussed the pauper and destitute aliens, used metaphor, focused on aliens in terms of their numbers, and discussed them as arrivals, rather than acknowledging their movement more generally. And sometimes this was because the newspapers were all reporting the same source material, like parliamentary debates, but similar language was also evident in original and editorial content. And I think that's really interesting. So, thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Ruth. I'm certain that paper will have engendered a number of interesting ideas, comments, and no doubt questions. So I'll pass over straight away to anyone who has any questions or comments. James first. Tessa, was that a hand up or is that?
I'm still formulating.
You're formulating. Well, James can kick us off, and then we'll see. We'll go from there.
Okay,
Go ahead, James.
I have lots of questions. That's really interesting, but I will start with one, and I'll come back to this later if they're not covered. So the thing about alien being used as a subtle way of saying Jewish, that really fascinated me, because that was right at the beginning when you mentioned the lack of identity. I was thinking, is that for that reason? And then you kind of talked through it. That was really fascinating. And I don't know much about the kind of historiography of how Jewish people are described at the back end of the 19th century, and more about earlier periods, I guess. So what is the historiography there? Is this something that you're coming at, which is kind of confirming existing historiographical kind of debate around how Jewish people are referred to at the back end of the 19th century in Britain? Or is this something that is either not there or is kind of running counter to what the historiographical kind of work is in there?
I think it's kind of between the two. So I think it's kind of acknowledged that the Aliens Act was a sort of response to this community arriving or increasing. And I think also it's widely recognised that, for example, one of the, I think it was the report into the sweating trade, specifically one of the reports, was funded by Arnold White, who I mentioned earlier. He played a huge role in it, and he was kind of integral in bringing in a lot of Jewish participants as witnesses, and I think he did kind of engineer how that went a little bit. So I think that's kind of well documented. I haven't come across very much that explicitly looks at word meaning in this kind of way, in this more looking at the sort of the discourses surrounding and the connotation. I haven't really come across much doing that. So I think it's kind of implicit in the historiography, but I don't think I've really come across it spelt out that it was kind of a euphemism for. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers it.
I think it does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tess, are you ready, or otherwise we'll pass over to Adam, and then Adam afterwards.
I think it relates to also James' question. So, because I was wondering how you use or apply this semantic group of identity. So, what specifically were you looking for there? Because I'm wondering also how, if we sort of impose this idea of identity or concept onto the 19th century press, then there might be a mismatch of what we think about when we think about identity and how they might have used that. So I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more what you specifically meant with identity in relation to the aliens.
I suppose I hadn't thought about it in a more kind of in-depth theory of identity or anything. It was more just the word that sprang to mind as describing what I'd recognised as being something that was kind of happening.
So
I think,
do you mean also in that it differs from the way aliens are, refugees?
I think that was the thing. I think it was
either.
more, I was looking at what it was possible for the news to do and what alien wasn't doing that was happening with other words. So I think when you look at immigrant, it's often used to describe British people moving to, kind of immigrating to the colonies. It's not really used to describe people coming into Britain. And so I think that there's kind of, the words associated with that are very different. And then having looked at refugees again, it's very different. And it's just looking at what it was possible. I think it's very difficult to find individuals in the paper, but when you look at individuals too, it's often sort of such and such their name, their age, their gender, their occupation. And I think what struck me was just the lack of any of that kind of information around alien, even though it was actually being used to refer to actual people. So I went and visited some alien quarters the other day. There's just no detail there. And I think it was more just looking at what the press was doing elsewhere and what it wasn't doing here. But I think with these kind of, like I said, with these sort of absences, it's really difficult to prove anything, because if it's not there, who's to say that I'm not just imposing my modern conceptions of identity?
No, I wasn't suggesting that you're doing that, but I was just
But
wondering.
I think it's worth considering, definitely. Yeah.
So they remain quite faceless always.
I think that's it, yeah. I was struck by a sort of facelessness and wanted to see if that was happening elsewhere, and it doesn't appear to have been happening elsewhere.
James? Oh, sorry, Adam. Apologies. James, you've already had your turn, James. Adam.
I'd like to follow up, I think, as well on James's question, thinking about the historiography and how you intersect with the historiography. And you started your paper by saying that you were going to tell us the conclusions that had come as a result of your corpus linguistic approach. I think a lot of what we find with this seminar is actually that these macro approaches to history actually raise questions rather than solve or provide answers. And when I watched your presentation, I think, like James, I came to the conclusion that there was a lot of concern about Eastern European Jewish migration into England at the end of the 19th century. And even in the response, I think, to the questions you've given so far, you're still looking at the macro approach. And I'm just wondering, knowing that there's a concern about this particular group who's quite actually easy to identify because they've got funny names by British standards, so that you can find these people, you can probably find some of them in the Dictionary of National Biography and actually find prominent people. So you can actually go in and do the micro work as well and understand how they're being viewed. And just to give you, I guess, an example of a modern refugee who we don't think of as a refugee, the pop singer Rita Ora, who's a refugee from Kosovo, I think, or Bosnia or something like that. She's not often presented in the language of being a refugee. Normally we just think of her as a successful pop singer. So you get the view of what people actually think of these individuals when you look at them on an individual level. But you might miss out if you're just thinking of them as aliens. And I know this is only part of your work, but I just thought I'd kind of throw that at you.
Yeah, I think it's something I still need to do with the alien aspect of it, but which has happened more with the refugee aspect. And I think I sort of, when I was thinking, how do you approach this kind of project? How do you find things in a corpus? If you're looking at the way in which immigrants and refugees were spoken about, how do you do that? And I sort of thought, well, begin with the big terms, see what the associations of those are. And I think it helps that there's a lot of that being done by contemporary linguists, but not necessarily in the 19th century, so there's scope for comparison as well. But I think having now done that, really, I do want to move on to the next bit. And I think with refugees, I have already done that, because I think with refugees, because there's that more multifaceted approach, it's much less faceless. You do get references to individuals appearing within the collocates, so you can then follow those references to individuals and see how they're being spoken about in their own right. So for a lot of the revolutionaries that are mentioned, there's a huge kind of cult of personality around a lot of them. And so it's quite easy to access the really high profile figures. And when you're looking at the kind of the alien articles, I think just accidentally you occasionally come across adjacent articles, it's sort of the nature of it that you end up reading a bit more than you should, and come across articles that you weren't originally meant to be looking at, and you get references to people like Mazzini, and you get kind of I don't know, high profile immigrants who have made a life for themselves in London and gained quite a lot of fame. And so I think they're the next kind of people that I want to go and look at, and I have with refugees but not with aliens. But it is quite difficult because you do end up being limited to the high profile people. And I don't think I've got to the point yet where I feel as if I can actually get in and look at, so I suppose this is specifically concerned with the impoverished Eastern European kind of immigrants. How do I access them?
That's where historiography must come into play, because surely there has been historiography on poor Eastern European Jewish migrants into Britain. So that their footnotes will tell you what the sources are to get at those lives. So that's, I guess, just drawing on James's point that, and what we always say at this seminar is, how does it fit with the existing historiography that's done in a more traditional way?
So it's kind of taking it that step. I think it's difficult too when you've got a project that you always say a PhD, that's a self-contained project that you're working within, and you're very aware of the limitations of that, and that it's opening all these really exciting new questions, and that you are going to have to, with a lot of those, park them for the time being and come back to it later. But that is really something that I do want to do. And I think one thing that that you notice a lot is that when you do try and look for individuals and find ways of looking for individuals, I've tried all sorts of different things, just kind of looking for alien in proximity to, I don't know, man or woman, or just on a wider scale, that kind of thing, trying lots of different things. And if you think about when these sort of individuals make the news, it's very often that it's within the context of sort of criminal trials and things like that, particularly in Reynolds, which had a huge focus on crime reporting. I think the only way that you can access any kind of individuals who weren't high status individuals or involved with politics or likely to be named in the context of a meeting is if they appeared in court and it was reported on because it was a sensational court case. So I think you're right that I do need to then go and look at the historiography of the individual. But I think if I was then to come back to the corpus and think, right, how can I try and find them in the corpus? I'm not sure whether it's possible to do that, whether they're even there, really. So that's not really answered it, has it? That's the sort of, you've given me more questions.
Go ahead, yeah.
I should apologise because I think this is just going to expand your project even more, but are there any aliens talking about alienism in Reynolds? And have you looked at any of the Jewish agitation against the 1905 Act? What
not
language terms
really come across that in the newspapers. I think more refugees, it comes up a lot, but in relation to aliens, no. They just don't appear to be there, really. It's not something that these particular newspapers were reporting upon. And you get it a lot with the refugees. You get a lot of letters from people saying, I'm a refugee, and or commentators in defence of saying, well, I'm from this kind of background. And so it's really quite prevalent there. And you also get with the refugees, which adds another interesting dimension, you get a lot of the collocates relate to charity, and a lot of it is refugee-run solidarity campaigns to try and fundraise for refugees present within Britain, and then you get all these networks, and that's really great. But it just doesn't... I haven't come across any Jewish commentators who speak out, who use the word alien, I should say, to speak out against the Alien Act.
So it's journalism post on others, but they don't identify.
Seems to be, yeah. So maybe I need to find other terms to find what they're using, or whether they're even in the newspapers.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I thought it was a really, really interesting paper, and it sounds like a great project. I've got two sort of small questions, really. I guess the first one is, how did you get around the issue of like optical character recognition problems in newspapers? And did you do any data cleaning, or was this a case of like you had enough material because you had so many issues of the newspapers to sort of not have to do that?
I think that partially dictated the ones that I focused. So I found that the Pall, Gazette and Reynolds newspaper are particularly clean. So they're very good ones to focus on because it's very easy to read, and then you'll open another one and the text will basically be gobbledygook, and I sort of avoid even going there. So I think I've copped out a little bit. Though I think I came to the conclusion that because of the limited time span, because I don't have the technical ability to clean it up myself, I would have to rely on others to clean it. The only way I could currently work with it is to deal with it in the state it's currently in and make what I can of it. And I feel as if in the future, if there was ever some kind of rescanning redigitizing initiative, which I can't see happening for the foreseeable, but if someone ever got the money from somewhere to do that and the man hours, then there may be future historians working with this in a much better form than I'm currently working with it, who'll be able to do better. But I think I'm just working with what is available to me at this point in time. So, yeah, that's, yeah.
The other question really was, why did you choose CQP Web? Was there any reason particular why you decided on that program rather than like Lanxbox or any other sort of program?
I don't just use CQP Web, so you can kind of, you can export text from it, download text from it, and then analyse it in other forms. So I also use, say, Anconc sometimes. I think it's partially because one of my supervisors created it. So there's someone on hand, which I'm not going to lie, there's someone on hand to sort of help me out with any technical issues that arise, and it just makes practical sense. And I think it would look a bit odd if I then said, you're my supervisor, but I'm not going to use this interface, I'm going to use this better. Yeah. But actually, it's the primary point of access. It's a primary way in which I can access these newspapers, so it is the form in which I have access to them, so practical reasons.
Okay, thanks.
Justin?
A slightly tangential comment rather than question, really. I'm a late medievalist. One thing I've been thinking about as you've been talking is the fact that the term alien crosses over from being only a purely technical legal term into public discourse only in 1450s, 60s, the time of economic crisis, and it becomes a pejorative term to sort of dehumanise aliens. So rather than talking about the Dutch or the Germans bringing technology or whatever in other periods, when there's public discourse against migrants, then the term alien is used, and then the specific tax, the alien subsidy, which is a poor tax on aliens. But the project that digitised that at York a few years ago called it England's Immigrants, which I think is very interesting reappropriation of those terms. But yeah, tying some use of the term with the economic cycle, I think it is actually quite clear, not just in your period, but going way back. Making those comparisons might be just a nice thing to think about.
Yeah, definitely. I'll have to look into that.
Just
I like the terminology as well. It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Once you get into that, yeah.
Just a little addition to that. There was a lot of Dutch immigrants into Norwich, and Norfolk in particular, and they're referred to in a much more positive sense as the strangers. And that has a very positive connotation.
So I wanted to use that as a word I just found it just wasn't really used in the newspapers in that sense in this period, which is a shame.
Yeah. And in the early modern period, that's very common. Yeah.
When the bad are aliens, when the good are strangers.
I was just interested, you mentioned, because obviously the subject of migration is studied a lot in the contemporary period in the media language. I was wondering how useful, because you mentioned Baker and people who are doing those kind of studies. I was wondering how useful you find that comparison, or is it sometimes a bit of a block that it kind of maybe predetermines how we think about that? Just, how you find the comparison with the present research on that subject.
It's good. I think you do find yourself reading the newspapers and thinking it's that thing that I noticed in the 19th century newspaper last week. So you see a lot of similarities, but I think you get that through history. I think it's a block in that a lot of the words that just kind of methodologically, and a lot of the words that they use aren't useful, so it's difficult to do direct comparisons because they're using immigrant anyways. It wasn't really used like that, and those kind of things. And I think you do kind of go to this kind of work expecting it to be overwhelmingly negative because you've read those kind of that kind of research. So I think you do go in with a preconception, but I don't know to what extent that it's I think it's what's more difficult is that you've got the linguists looking at stuff from the last 10 years, 15 years, and then you've got historians, but it's people doing linguistic studies of it in earlier periods than the past 10 years. So it'd be really great if someone could do something in the 1950s or 1920s or earlier than my period. But the kind of only linguistic point of comparison, and also if you're looking at frameworks for thinking about this, I think because historians have spoken about the phenomenon, they haven't necessarily spoken about the language, you're left looking at a lot of linguistic work to look at frameworks for how people are constructed and it's kind of done with the modern press in mind, so it's not necessarily always helpful, but it's what your only point of reference often.
It's really interesting.
Thanks.
Any other questions, or shall we let James have another bite of the cherry? We'll let James have another bite of the cherry.
Okay, so it's a two-part question that's predicated on whether or not what the answer to the first is, which you might know the answer, if you don't, someone else in the room might be able to help, which is that I don't remember the status of the Pall law in your period. Is it still tied to, and Pall relief, is it still tied to people's place of birth if they're domestic, as in if they're from the UK, if they're English? In the same way as in the 18th century, right? Is it still tied to
I know this, but I don't know.
Parish?
It's gone.
It should be tied to the settlement.
It's still tied to settlement.
I don't know when that ends though.
I don't know.
So let's assume it is for now. How is internal migration discussed? Is that because I know obviously in the 19th century internal migration is more common because people can move around more easily, but is this discussed at all? Are there kind of comparisons and contexts in which you can think about migration from outside a nation state and migration from outside a local area?
That's not something I've looked at, but I think that would be worth looking at. I can tell you I've looked at how poverty is discussed more widely, rather than just in relation to aliens. And that tends to very frequently associate with sort of lunacy. But I suppose because if you were mentally ill, you'd probably end up in the workhouse. And also just that it's more kind of the practicalities of it. So it's a lot of, are you an indoor pauper, an outdoor pauper, are you? It's kind of how are you going to be housed, how are you going to be fit into the system, basically. But I haven't looked at internal migration.
It may be something to look at, maybe something to think about in terms of
One
the use of those words.
thing I came across when I was looking at Alien initially was that in the Hampshire Telegraph, which doesn't really mention immigration very much, they had something called the Aliens and Natives celebration, the Aliens and Natives feast. And I was thinking, oh, this sounds great, this is going to be really interesting. And you start to read it, and it's basically that aliens was anyone from outside the parish, and natives was anyone from within the parish. And they just celebrated it every year with a big procession, and apprentices were given trophies and things, and that it was still called the Alien and the Natives feast, which I thought was very interesting.
That raises some interesting problems, doesn't it? Because it asks a question about how big the community is before you're dealing with an outsider. And now we generally think that all English people or all British people fit within the walls of the community, and if you're coming from outside of that, you're an outsider. Whereas if you go into the 1740s, it's somebody who lives across the road because there's a parish boundary between those two parishes, and they're from far away.
Different conceptions of belonging, and you get into all that.
I think the term that you would need to look at if you were going to look at internal migration is vagrant.
Vagrant? Why that one particularly?
Because that was the system that was used for getting rid of people who didn't qualify for local support.
And also, I guess what we're maybe getting at is there's something here about maybe the peculiarity of the London newspapers. And it's not, again, it's outside the scope of your study, right? But it could well be that there's very different types of alien being described when we're looking at provincial newspapers.
Yeah.
That it might not be referring just to perhaps the kind of the Jewish identity, it might be referring to a more broader sense of identity that includes other people from England or other people from the United Kingdom.
And in that context, I'm surprised, Adam, you didn't raise it, but you know what I'm going to... in that sense, you didn't do any collocations on Irish?
No, I think... Well, I didn't do collocations on nationalities in general. I did, but I didn't actually end up including it because I found that it created too much work after you'd done the collocations. So I think basically if you look for a nationality, the vast majority of references aren't to people of that nationality living in Britain. So if you look for Irish, there's just tens of thousands of results about Irish Home Rule. Or
well, I was just thinking of doing with Irish Alien
Irish
to see whether there was any...
If you look at the two in proximity, again, because Alien doesn't really appear to have been attributed, there's not very much generated. And then, so I tried various kind of nationalities with proximity searches to see if it came up with not to that much success, really, no. Which is a shame.
We might have time for one last question. Tessa.
Can I ask you, so you mentioned at the beginning before you went into the collocation analysis, so you seemed to be wondering about the question about the sort of influence of the press, and also looking at sort of the volume of the text and how these two, if you look at Pall Gazette and the other one, so one is a weekly, one is a daily, and then you say, okay, so there are more words that I'm looking at here, but you seem to wonder whether sort of where the real influence lies. Is it the sheer volume, so this daily, having daily exposure to, I don't know, articles about aliens, or sort of on the other end, is it sort of the weekly paper and there's a higher relevance because there are fewer articles? So, and you seem to be not quite sure about which was the more important argument there. So I was just wondering if you can come back to that a little bit, or what your kind of thought processes are.
I think it's just every time I think about it, I come away slightly less certain. I think it's so, because even today, I think if you've got a group of 1,000 newspaper readers and surveyed them, that doesn't even necessarily tell you about. I mean, it's thinking, what was the impact of the newspaper? How can we measure the impact? So you can look at geographical distribution or number of readers, but then you have the kind of radical, or the working class press, where you have all the hidden readers who aren't documented. And then you have the sort of the image that the newspapers had of themselves. So what did they think they were doing? And then anecdotes from readers who, and I just feel like there's so many different factors that it's very difficult to kind of gain an impression, other than the fact that it was impacting people. Obviously, if you're reading something, you're reading it repeatedly, and the array of newspapers that are available are saying similar things. You can infer things from that, but I think I'm very wary of saying anything too concrete, I think, about the impact, because there's absolutely no way that I can back it up. So it's something I'm thinking about quite a lot at the moment, because I'm writing up that section. And I'm just going around in circles, I think. Yeah. I mean, does anyone, do you have a kind of...
No, I also I agree with you that it's especially difficult if you look at sort of the 19th century readership. How can you make any clear assumptions about impact or so? Rather,
If it's a short question,
yes, just
or
follow up.
precise. Yes,
Do any historians or other writers deal with that issue adequately?
As in readership?
Yeah, have they broached that issue?
I think most of what I read, they're saying very similar things to what I haven't seen anyone conclusively come down and say this is a measurable thing. I think everyone's kind of talking around the subject, talking about the different factors that we need to consider, the different ways that we can measure it, but ultimately concluding that it's incredibly difficult to measure. I mean, even if you were to say exactly how many people read a newspaper, you don't know whether they read the article you're looking at within the newspaper. So it's just so difficult. I think the newspaper is so ephemeral as well. So I've kind of read a lot of people who've done either historians of the media or contemporary kind of media studies people, and they all seem to say that they think that broadly there's a consensus that the newspaper shapes opinion but is also shaped by its readers, that there's a cycle going on there, but actually falling down and measuring that, no one seems to want to commit to that.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Ruth. And please let us all thank Ruth for a very thought-provocative and interesting presentation, and certainly a great project. So thank you very much. Just a word or two before you all go. Ruth unfortunately can't join us for a drink or for dinner, but we are still hoping to go at least for a quick drink to the University Arms on Store Street, or College Arms. Get it right, College Arms, isn't it? On Store Street, so please join us there for a quick drink if you can, and we'll carry on the conversation. And thank you again, Ruth. We are officially going to meet in 3 week times, but that may change due, of course, to the UCU strike. At the moment, we are scheduled to have Lizzie Stewart on the 6th of March from UEA, looking at English designed landscapes, 1550 to 1660, using 3D GIS to recreate prospects and promenades. But please do check our website if it is indeed rescheduled for later in the term. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you all again very soon. Thanks. Well, thank you very much.
I think it's quite a lot.
No, it's all. No, you were very fluid, and came across really clear and everything else. You weren't stuck to the text. You knew it. So you're sticking down. So, no, very well done.